I'm joined today with my co-host, Sarah Graff. I'm based in Beirut, Sarah's in New York, and our special guest is Ahmed Badr, who is based in Houston. Sarah Graff is an associate curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art. In 2006, she was a Hagop Kevorkian Curatorial Fellow. She earned her PhD from NYU's Institute of Fine Arts in 2012. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me. And I will let you introduce our special guest.
Thank you so much, Mikey. I'm delighted to be here and so honored to be introducing Ahmed. Ahmed Badr is a 22-year-old author, poet, multimedia artist, social entrepreneur, and former Iraqi refugee, working at the intersection of creativity, displacement, and youth empowerment. So that's quite a mouthful. I'll let that sink in for a second. He basically does everything. Ahmed's work seeks to combine poetry, archival collections, and multimedia to explore the complexities of migration, identity, and self-expression, with a focus on reframing and reclaiming the power of tragedy. He's the author of the book, While the Earth Sleeps, We Travel, Stories, Poetry, and Art from Young Refugees Around the World. And it's a wonderful book. Maybe we can drop a link in the chat to the book's website. Ahmed is also the storyteller behind UNPACKED, Refugee Baggage, a multimedia installation that remodels the homes of refugees inside a series of suitcases in an effort to humanize and give voice to a demographic that is often viewed in the abstract. He's the host of Virginia Public Media's Resettled podcast, the co-host of the World Bank's #Youth for Climate live series, and the former host of the UN Migration Agency's A Way Home Together podcast. So without further ado, please welcome Ahmed.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Mikey, for having me.
Ahmed, when do you sleep? What's that question?
Quite a bit, actually. This is like the illusion. Quite a bit, you know? That's the illusion is that I don't, but I do quite a bit. Yeah.
So, Sarah, do you mind if I ask a basic question? Because you've known Ahmed for a little longer than I have. So maybe, Ahmed, you're calling in from Houston. You know, as Sarah was reading your bio, there's a lot of stuff related to, you know, refugee stories and sort of storytelling and platforming voices. When did you first start caring about this? Maybe that's a stupid question, but I think it's worth you trying to give us some sort of perspective. When did you first start thinking to yourself, I want to spend my time doing this. I care about this.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it started sophomore year of high school. I was still trying to figure out, okay, well, we've been in the US now. So my family background, I was born in Iraq. We left in 2006. We spent 2 years in Syria and were resettled to the US as refugees in 2008. And a few years after being in the US, about 4 years or so at that point, I was trying to figure out my own place in this new country. I was trying to figure out, okay, well, I'm Iraqi American, Muslim refugee, where do all these identities fit? Can I claim all of them? Do I claim one or the other? And during my sophomore year, I was invited to go to a journalism conference in DC, the Washington Journalism and Media Conference hosted by George Mason University. And for this conference, they made us create a website, a blog, and I went all out. I created this, and I got domain, got business cards, and flew out to DC. And for the first time, I started realizing that, you know, my exploration of this identity was important and that others cared about it, but also selfishly that it was helping me figure out my own place in the world. So that's how it kind of started. And then after that conference, a family friend encouraged me to start writing about my own family story. And at the time, as a high schooler, you don't want to be different than anyone else. So I didn't think that we even had a story to tell, but then, you know, started, with small essays, poems here and there, and started putting them up on this blog. And, you know, that conference really, again, made me realize that these were important works and that I had a story to tell in the first place. And so from there, I thought, okay, well, this was nice, but this is just for me. Why not make it more widely available? And that's when I founded my organization, Narratio, which is focused on the publishing of the work of young people from around the world, displaced or otherwise, across poetry, art, photography, what have you. And so that's how the work initially started, is just realizing that I even had a story to tell, and then realizing that there were folks that were ready to hear that story, and then, you know, linking both of those together, and then, you know, starting this mission of trying to create spaces where young people displaced or otherwise can share stories on their own terms in ways that feel authentic to them, rather than some external force.
Thanks, Ahmed. I feel like I feel like your skill as a storyteller is really, I mean, that's what we're going to be talking about in a lot of depth today, but it's one of those things that's easy to kind of state, but it's harder to feel. And I wonder if we can look at the Unpacked Refugee Baggage exhibition, which I loved, and which was the first time you and I met each other 3 years ago. But maybe talk a little bit about how you and Mohammed Hafez, your co-curator of that exhibition, like really thought about making these stories three-dimensional through visuals, audio, engagement with the space. How did you go about that process?
Absolutely. So we started this project in I think the summer of 2017. Mohammed and I were connected through a mutual friend. I was a student at Wesleyan University at the time, and we wanted to combine both of our, you know, I don't say areas of expertise, but both of our areas that were really dear to us, and we had done some work in. With him, it was architecture and creating these powerful miniatures, you know, depicting scenes from his home country of Syria, and then really combining that with my experience at that point with stories and audio stories. And so really we sought out to create a project that combined both of those skill sets, but that again allowed those individuals that we wanted to work with to share their own stories on their own terms. And so we sat down with the 9 families and individuals resettled as refugees to the greater New Haven area, a lot of whom Mohammed had already known for a couple of years. And we sat down and I interviewed them. We interviewed them together. And as I was doing these interviews, Mohammed would sit down and take notes around kind of the different architectural aspects of those stories. And then once those interviews wrapped up, you know, we worked on a series of 9 suitcases depicting different scenes from each of those individual stories. And these scenes would, you know, be rendered in miniature through these suitcases. And then each would have an audio component featuring a snippet, 2 to 3 minute snippet of that individual story. So really inviting you to experience someone else's story in a way that is very visceral, it's very real, it's right there in front of you. It's something that we can all relate to in some way, shape, or form. The rooms in our homes that we appreciate, the homes as a whole that we appreciate, and each scene, you know, powerfully explores a different story through the specific room or the specific house, including Muhammad's own story and my own family story. So there's 2 different suitcases that depict that. There's one here in the bottom left, you know, that's from Muhammad's story, and you know, each one depicts something else. And it's also working with folks from different parts of the world, folks from you know, obviously Iraq and Syria, but also Sudan. And so we really wanted to make sure that these stories were represented in ways that are, again, accessible, but also ways that do justice to those individuals who are telling them. So 9 suitcases, non-audio files accompanying each. And I've been very privileged to have been able to tour this project around the country for the past 4 years now. Yeah, very, very grateful, because that's how we initially met. We had the exhibit at UNICEF House in New York City. And that's where I met you, Sarah, for the first time. And just so grateful that this project brought us together.
Me too, Ahmed. Yeah, it's really remarkable the way that you were able to make these stories relatable to a really broad audience. But I think I want to build on that and talk about something that's come up for me that I know we've talked about before, but I really want to get into, which is you can be a wonderful storyteller, but how do you grapple with the fact that people may not be able to hear what you're saying? And I know that this is a factor for the young people that you work with as well. You can do all of the work of putting your story into your own terms, reframing it for yourself, but there's no guarantee that that will be understood and received by an audience. So where does that leave you? You know, what does that do to the process or to the storyteller?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think speaking from my own personal experience and my own sharing of my own story in the beginning, honestly, it wasn't something I ever thought about. You know, I was so focused on reaching the folks who wanted to listen or who were not necessarily on my side, but were just open to listening. I was so focused on those communities that I really didn't have time to focus on those communities that, you know, in the first place didn't want to hear me in the first, hear whether it's about refugees or stories or what have you. And so I tried to spend most of my time thinking about not necessarily, you know, isolating myself and creating this echo chamber of everyone that agrees with me, but really meeting folks where they're at and, you know, meeting them where their story is, and then, you know, sharing my own if appropriate in that case. And I found that to be a really very powerful entry point, both for the folks that we may consider as an audience to this work, but also to the individuals who are maybe creating work for different audiences. And so the audience always has a way of gravitating, I think, to the folks that are sharing this work. But I also recognize that you know, my experience is not necessarily the experience of every other storyteller that may have had a similar background, right? So I recognize kind of the privileges that I've been able to have to be able to share my story with different audiences across the world. And through, you know, the different projects, I try to focus on expanding that audience in different ways. But I want to have that expansion be informed by those individuals I'm working with. You know, it's very difficult to start a project only thinking about who's against you, you know, or who might be opposed to what you're trying to do. I think it's an important consideration, but I think it's one that I try to only think about after whatever that project is done. And ultimately, the project lives way beyond you, right? So whether it's an exhibit, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a program, every individual that you work with and the work that they end up producing and the different audiences that end up intersecting with it, that travels way beyond just that initial intention, right? So I think it's important for that initial intention to be strong, but it's very difficult to control it once it's out there in the world. And I just hope that it's, you know, it's creating a positive in different ways. Even, you know, with the book that you mentioned, now that people have likened it to, you know, giving birth and having the baby adopted by someone else. You know, I don't know how many copies are sold at this point, but there are lots of adoptions happening, I hope. And yeah.
Ahmed, I have a question for you. For a project like Unpacked, which you conceived of in the way you tell the story, you know, you've conceived of it a few years ago. You know, it's been a while since you started that this baby's been out in the open, right? And in that time, you've gotten a lot of reps. You've done a lot of stuff in that time. So if you were to go back to speak to Ahmed in the beginning of the conception, when you were doing those interviews, when you were, you know, thinking through the concept of this project, what do you think you got, quote unquote, wrong then? What would you have said? Hey, don't interview this way, or try interviewing this way, or like this design choice in conception, try to expand this, try to contract that, because I'm sure you've learned an enormous amount. And there's like new insights that you've gotten that if you could go back and give yourself advice, you probably would give you know, maybe do things a little differently for better or worse.
Yeah, I'm very, very proud of, you know, Mohammed and the entire project and everyone who's in it. And I think
yeah, of course,
the stories are just so incredible. And I think there isn't like too much I would change, but I think maybe the thing that I think would have been very helpful is having kind of I feel like, you know, this was my first time working on an exhibit, right? And, you know, Mohammed had worked on exhibits before, but this was really the first time, you know, he was working with a collaboration of this kind. So we both learned so much throughout that process. But I think, you know, speaking personally, I think my, you know, in the beginning, when we were conceiving of this project, we had so many different ways to take it. We thought, okay, well, do we just do these 9? Do we do these, you do 50 of them? Do we travel around? Do we do all these, you know? So I think eventually we figured out that let's just focus on the stories that we are working with now and then see where we go from here. So trusting the process and the evolution of the project beyond yourself and your immediate kind of vision for it has been a huge learning experience, and something that I've come to learn and appreciate, where,
Cool.
Whatever hope you may have for a project in the beginning doesn't necessarily mean that's where it will end up. And that doesn't mean that it's successful or not, So
Yeah.
I think just personally, that was a powerful thing to learn, and that like what you initially work on, what you initially put out in the world, again, lives on its own. And we've been very lucky for it to have been able to travel so much and have so many different folks see it and interact with it. But I think looking back, I think the one thing that I wish I had more of at that time is that understanding and patience of that vision, and recognizing that, it just lives beyond you, and you have to be able to trust the universe to, have it travel wherever it travels. So I think it's that patience and just trusting that patience and that trusting of the process that I think I've learned so much from through the project. Yeah.
Well, that kind of brings me to, I think, our collaboration, Ahmed, which maybe we can show a few images and talk about the really wonderful project that the Narratio Fellows did last year. But that really makes me think about, I'm going to ask you to tell the story of how that came about and what happened. But I think what I am pulling out for myself is that we had no idea what would come out of this either. And we really had to trust the process as well. So maybe you can tell everyone what we did last summer.
Absolutely. So the Narratio Fellowship started, I guess two summers ago, but it all started with a trip to Syracuse. I was doing a lecture and a workshop at Syracuse University, and the workshop was at a local community center called the Northside Learning Center, and the heavily immigrant and refugee neighborhood in Syracuse. And we did the workshop, and it's a literacy center for everyone from ages 7 to 87. And it was a snow day, and snow days in upstate New York are really snow days. And we did the storytelling workshops, and I've been doing these storytelling workshops for the past 4 or 5 years. And this workshop, we had 40, 50 kids, really early high school to late high school, and a bit younger in some cases. And after that, I met Professor Bryce Nordquist, who is a professor at Syracuse University of Writing. He's the director of the graduate writing program there. And a few months passed, and I spoke to Bryce about this idea of having a specific program for resettled refugee youth to be able to share stories that represent the fullest extent of their experiences. This was a year or so after I had done the traveling for the book in Greece, and that was more of those, same workshops. But I thought, let's create a program where young people can, again, share their stories, but share their stories in different ways. And then I remembered, our conversation, our several conversations I've had with Sarah in the past about this idea of stories and museums and this connection between object, human, and space, and the space that holds both of them. And then we, worked on this idea together of what if the fellows, as kind of their culminating event or culminating kind of performance and collaboration, what if they pick objects from the ancient Near East galleries and reimagine their labels as poems, but taking into account their own personal stories, their own personal experiences, their own personal identities. And that's what we did. So during the fellowship is a year long, there's a month-long residential component in the beginning where the fellows really get access to different kinds of storytelling with a specific focus. And so that focus was on poetry that first year. And so Mike, if you want to go back just one slide real quick, the fellows picked those objects, and by the end of that month, we traveled down to New York City, and they got to see those objects for the very first time. They got to interact with them, and with the help of Sarah and the incredible team at the A&E and the education team at the Met as well, got to learn more about those objects, but also be able to share their own experiences, interacting with them and learning about them, for the previous month or so. And the day before and it all culminated in a performance of those very poems at the Royal Assyrian Court. The picture in the middle is of Sarah introducing that performance on, was it July 31st, 2019? Yeah. And it was just such a wonderful, wonderful collaboration that, you know, continues to grow in different ways. And really the day before the performance, the last thing I'll say, we got to go to the Met an hour before it opened. And fellows met Sarah, met the team, and got to find those objects for the first time in that scavenger hunt. And, you know, they've been performing those poems ever since then. They've had an exhibit both locally in Syracuse. They performed at the UN. They had an exhibit at Christie's and performed there as well. And they've just continued sharing those poems, all of which are published in the book that Sarah mentioned. We published that a month ago now, just a little bit over a month ago. So really, it's again giving those displaced young people a chance to share whatever they want to share. And those poems covered so many different issues, not always necessarily relating to displacement, but really, again, whatever they wanted to focus on.
So I want to talk, I think there's a good opportunity to sort of speak really, really directly about how you're finding these people, right? So the people who apply to be in this program, who eventually write all, you know, create all this art, and then which ends up being in this book that you just published, in a really like simplest terms possible. How are you finding these people?
Yeah, so for the fellowship, all of the fellows we met through the community partner, so the Northside Learning Center. They really worked on, you know, creating. We worked together on creating the application, but really they were in charge of recruiting and finding fellows that would be a good fit for the program. So that's specific to the fellowship. That's a community component, and that literacy center really helped us find those fellows. And then with Narratio as a whole, it started with just word of mouth, just reaching out to folks on Instagram, reaching out to folks that were friends of friends. And then once we were, you know, whether it was a feature with media or collaborating with the UN or BuzzFeed or other organizations, those have their own kind of effects and more people hear about it. And one of the kind of the main transition points, or one of the highlights of that, was being featured on All Things Considered on NPR. And right after that, then all these folks in America and beyond the world realized what Narratio wanted to do, and then started submitting more of their work and became contributors and that. So it's a combination of both community-led engagement and recruitment, and then more online stuff.
And sorry, Sarah, I'm just going to ask a follow-up real quick. Was the goal always to sort of to publish, you know, to create this object, to create this book that is like persistent? Was that always the idea, or, you know, are you just sort of exploring step by step and exploring all these new possibilities?
Yeah, a book was always something I wanted to do. I wasn't sure if it was going to be just focused on my own personal story, kind of like a memoir type thing. And I tried to do that earlier on. And as you know, it's very experimented with different kinds of, okay, well, do we do a book on this? Do we do a book on that? One thing that was always apparent throughout was this power of having a physical, permanent thing that honored all of the different folks that we were working with. That was always something that we wanted to do. And then, you know, with this book, we were able to do that in a different way. You know, it wasn't just, I was able to kind of do both, where I was still able to kind of share some of my personal experiences throughout, but have it be centered on the work itself, and more so on the stories that, you know, my own story was able to create maybe different spaces for other stories to exist beyond it and beside it. And so really, I think it's an outgrowth of the work. The book is almost Narratio in, you know, book form, you know, this idea that you have poems, stories, photographs, drawings in one place and made accessible to folks from around the world. So I think it was a natural growth of what we were already doing, but definitely something that's completely new, and that, you know, there's a new way of reaching reaching different audiences. And it's also something that everyone featured in the book can hold on to for generations and can just have and say, this is something that is permanent. You know, and again, one thing I always like to think about is this idea of permanence as a luxury for a lot of folks that we work with that are displaced. And so this book is a way of honoring that sentiment and making something permanent among things that aren't.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of feeds nicely into what I wanted to bring up, what your work really brings to mind for me, which is that, you know, art and poetry are not directly connected in the minds of many privileged Americans, certainly with really, you know, marginalized populations, oppressed people fleeing, you know, refugees. This is, I find that like formulation of first world problems to be very like dehumanizing, but you know, people need poetry, they need art. People, no matter what their current living situation is, if anything, I think people who are living in more desperate circumstances need art and poetry even more. And I'd mentioned to you earlier the essay by Audre Lorde called "Poetry is Not a Luxury," and this is such a profound formational kind of influence on my thinking about art and what, you know, as a curator at this very elite museum at the Met, like, who am I serving? Who is this art for? Who is it helping? But this Audre Lorde essay, she makes a very strong case for someone who is deeply involved in politics, that art and poetry are not separate from that in her experience. And art and poetry are ways to make the intangible tangible, and also to kind of explore your own subjectivity in the world, explore the sense of yourself as a subject. And I mean, there's a lot more in that, but I'm wondering if we can kind of explore that a little bit. Like, what is this doing for the young people themselves? Maybe draw that focus away from the audience and put it more on the people who are doing the work, what it means to them.
Absolutely. So I think first and foremost, it's, you know, and taking the fellowship as kind of a central example, when the fellows walk into the Met, they're not just walking in as visitors, they're walking in as poets, as cultural producers, right? And then they're performing their work, you know, as those cultural producers, and then that work can then travel in different ways. So I think first and foremost, it creates this idea that, or it expands on this idea that your story as a displaced young person goes beyond the tragedy that you may have experienced of that initial displacement, right? So first, I think it's creating a space for that fullest extent of that story to exist in different ways. And then it's pairing that with, you know, different institutions that normally have controlled and dominated the narrative, right, around what it means to be displaced or what it means to tell a story of displacement. And that's another really key thing here too, is that, are you sharing the story of displacement, or are you sharing the story of someone who happens to be displaced, right? And that's a very key question that, you know, whether it's the fellowship or other parts of my works trying to make a distinction where, you know, someone who's been displaced, their story goes beyond that displacement. And so how can we create spaces where they can feel comfortable, if they are interested, to share that fullest extent beyond that initial displacement? So I think ultimately, I hope that this work for the individuals that it touches and that it collaborates with creates those spaces, and then, you know, hopefully inspires those individuals to create those spaces on their own, and then having kind of an effect that reverberates in that way, where you're creating spaces that end up creating other spaces, and then, you know, at some point, then the narrative will change, and it won't change to one thing, but it will change to multiple things, and that's what really we're trying to do, is to create this kind of multitude of expressions around stories that may contain displacement but aren't displacement stories.
Thanks.
Yeah, because I think that's a really interesting idea, because like by definition, any story that is true for them contains this displacement, right? Because it's a part of their story. It's a meaningful part of their story. So even if they're talking about like how they live and die on the basketball court, right? That in some way is about that, right? Because this is who they are. This is it's not who they are, but it helps shape the way they see the way they see the world. I'd like to, Sarah, if it's okay with you, I'd like to transition into the Q&A, and then we'll sort of open up. There's a ton of stuff that we can talk about. I think if we have time at the end, just talking about the way you think about new media is a really interesting thing. You've worked on so much stuff. So if we have time at the end, I think we can come back to to come back to a bunch of the stuff you've worked on, but I'd like to go to our quick Q&A for now. So what are you reading or watching right now?
Oh my goodness. I'm reading a few things right now. There's this memoir by Edward Said, Out of Place, making my way through that. It's been really, really interesting. Like everyone else right now, I'm reading the Obama memoir, Promised Land. Listening to that, actually, my first, I got an Audible account just to listen to it. And
how many hours is that Audible? Is that book?
29 hours. That's on the normal
Yeah,
speed.
it's like 700 pages, 29 hours. Jeez Louise.
Yeah. And it's all read by him,
Great.
which is, I feel like, more impressive, like to be able to just read for 29 hours. And then the last one is I'm reading Dark Towers by David Heinrich on the history of Deutsche Bank, which has been really fascinating. And then watching, I feel like I'm like so basic. I'm watching The Crown with my family right now, season 4.
No judgment.
That's been no judgment. That's been very interesting. So yeah, that's what I'm looking at.
Cool. Okay, who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Oh my goodness. I had this answer before Sultan Qasimi joined this call. So this is just, I'm not sucking up to Sultan. This is very true, but he is one of those people I feel like I would love to shadow for a day. And I think just more broadly, someone who works with art so intimately and is an art collector, but their art collection is informed by their own lived experience, right? And their own heritage, their own history. And so, yeah, I had that answer before, I promised. I didn't know Sultan was going to join the call, but someone like Sultan, or someone who, again, is informed, whose experience is informed by their own past, but was always looking for the future and creating other spaces for artists across the world, and especially the Arab world, to be able to share their work and feel proud of the sharing of their work across different audiences. So yeah, that's my answer.
Great. I endorse. What do people most misunderstand about your work? Or I guess if you want to talk about your line of work as well.
We talked about this a little bit before, but that it's beyond just the inspiring stories. I'm not on a mission to just tell inspiring stories. If they are inspiring, that's great. But the point is not to just have someone hear a story and think, oh, that's inspiring. Okay, what's next? It's more so to think about what spaces that story creates, but also thinking about the fullest extent of a person's experience, whether it's touched by displacement or not. I feel like we're limited by certain narratives, regardless if we're displaced or not. And so I think it's not necessarily reducing or being reductive about the mission of the work and saying it's just about creating spaces for inspiring stories, but it's creating spaces for stories of all kinds, regardless if they're inspiring or not.
Cool. And this one I really wanted to ask you, whose work do you admire or are inspired by? Especially given the line of work you're doing, you're producing all this stuff and you're helping create opportunities for people to produce. So who do you look to for inspiration, or who do you admire? Whose work do you admire?
So many humans, so many people. I think one that immediately comes to mind is Khalid Hosseini, author of The Kite Runner, someone was a source of initial inspiration with writing, as going back to school, but again, someone that has found a remarkable way of sharing stories that transcends borders, that transcends so many different audiences, and someone whose work is a constant invitation. I think that's one thing that I'm always really touched by, this idea that an artist or a writer or museum professional like Sarah, their work is an invitation to create so many different things. And so I think that's what kind of comes to mind, is that whose work do you see that always invites you in and invites you to explore your own perspective and intersection with whatever that work is. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we have one question in the chat. I'm sure we'll have more soon, but we'll start with Marianne.
It's a pleasure to listen to you. And I had the opportunity to meet Mohammed here in Seattle and had some pretty interesting conversations with him about the impulse to make this work. And what I really am curious about is when you went to the UN, where you would have an international audience with an audience of people who actually control borders, what was their feedback, or was there any at all, for your experience there?
Yeah, it's really important question. Really appreciate you for asking it. I think there are a couple of different layers to it, right? Because I had the honor of speaking at the UN, several times, and those first couple of talks were very different from the rest, right? Or the first few, because in the beginning I was so awestruck, and I am to a point, of the institution, right? Like you're there, you're speaking in front of this audience, and you're thinking so much about the audience and obviously the space that you're delivering this in, that you don't really have time to unpack what it actually means to be there. You're just like, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. This is what I'm offering. And then I think after the fifth or sixth time, I became more aware of the placement of my story within different institutions. I thought, okay, well, what am I offering here? What is kind of my invitation, and is it serving those who I'm actually working with, right? And I think that's an impulse. It's a question that's so important, regardless if it's the UN or any other institution, is that, okay, well, what is my placement here? What's my positioning? What's my, what's situating my own story here? And then who is that serving? So that's a question that I've always asked myself and tried to think about. And that, came up so many different times as I did those talks. In terms of how those talks were received, I think, I had the honor of connecting with so many different folks that, again, are at the forefront of not only, controlling borders, but also in leading the storytelling around displacement in different ways, whether it's spokespersons or what have you. And it was fascinating to learn from them how, that narrative was shaped in different ways. And I think one thing that was really exciting and that was really powerful is that those individuals who are controlling that narrative are aware of their own privilege and of what they're bringing to the table, and are really committed to bringing other voices to be able to represent that issue maybe more fully or in a more comprehensive way. And so I think I went from kind of obviously being still impressed by the grandeur of the institution and what it does, but I think more appreciative of the day-to-day things that don't necessarily come to the surface. And I've had the honor of working with different agencies within the UN to have been able to see that in different ways. And so I think ultimately it was just a better understanding of my own place within the system. And then by extension, everyone else that I, work with. The fellows for the fellowship, they all got to visit the UN. And then a couple of months later, they came back and performed and spoke on panels there. And so really, after the fellowship, I really became so much more committed to, whenever I entered those spaces, I had to be able to share those spaces with folks that I work with, because my own experience within that space is going to be different from someone who's never been there before. And so I think it's just constantly being aware of my own placement within that system, but also in the ways that system can serve the communities that I work with. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Marianne. Sarah, do you want to ask another question as we wait? If you don't have one, I have one as well.
I do.
Yeah, please.
I'm going to scoop you. I'm going to go in.
Yeah.
I think maybe it would be a good time to talk about it. You had mentioned it earlier, Mikey, about Ahmed's thoughts on new media and particularly on podcasts. And, podcasts are really having a moment for sure. But why do you think that is? And what do you think, how do you see this kind of fitting into your thoughts about storytelling, people's voice, people's own ownership of their narratives, and how does that fit with podcasting?
Yeah, so I've had the honor of working on two podcasts. First was A Way Home Together, as you mentioned, and then more recently, Resettled with VPM, Virginia Public Media. And one thing that I've seen across those two projects, but also across the medium as a whole, is this incredible accessibility, but also an accessibility that's so intimate, and that's, again, ultimately an invitation, right? It's I think first the fact that you can listen to podcasts at any time, and you can do really whatever you want to be doing. Like it's something that you could always tap into, just logistically speaking. You know, you don't have to necessarily sit down and watch and have to, you know, it's something you can always be doing. And so that's, I think, a key part of it. Another part of it is that I think it's you know, the interviewing process for podcasts is so, again, it's intimate, but it also is, it creates so many different dynamics that, again, expand this idea of an invitation. One thing, this actually relates back to the Unpacked exhibit earlier on. We played around with this idea of filming the interviews. You know, we're like, okay, should we film these interviews or not? And then very quickly realized that no, like that level of intimacy was gone the moment you turn on the camera, right? Because there's so much more pressure. There's just more that you have to think about when you're thinking about your, like, how you're appearing, right? Versus how you sound, you know? So I think there's again, a level of accessibility there that creates a really powerful rapport between the interviewer and the interviewee. And again, invites them to participate in whatever way that makes sense to them.
That's really interesting, that kind of the necessity of having that personal boundary there, you know, that you bring up. I've never thought about that before, but now you're making me think about, you know, now that we're all on Zoom all the time, it's kind of the difference between being on a Zoom or a video call and having like an old-fashioned phone conversation. Like a podcast is much more like that. And maybe there's some relief in there, you know?
Absolutely. And even I think I've realized this too with Zoom a bit lately, where when I'm trying to, like, I'm scheduling a call and I immediately assume that they mean it's like a Zoom call. And then like I've had a couple of people where it's like, no, just like on the phone. I'm like, oh yeah, sure. And then I pick up the phone and it's like I feel like I've forgotten how to have a phone call on the phone. But it's so much easier and so much less stressful. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, funnily enough, most of the podcast services in 2006 and 2007 were actually phone banks that you would call into the service.
Mm-hmm. Public access, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a question from Dima.
I'm going to plug in my laptop real quick. Sorry,
sure.
It's dying. Yeah.
Okay, so the question from Dima is, who says, I have high background noise. So of the different projects you've worked on, which gave you the biggest spur of personal growth? And did you find different types of projects touched you personally in unique ways than others? Thanks, Dima.
Oh my goodness, that's such an amazing question. I think all of them in so many different ways. I think the first project is always obviously the most impactful in terms of growth, because it just throws you in and then you're just trying to figure it out. So I think a Way Home Together podcast was big, and also because it allowed me to live in New York for a summer and to be able to, you know, enter the UN and go around and meet so many amazing humans. I think that was quite transformative, and I was very, very lucky to, you know, be able to be part of that ecosystem and be able to figure my way through it. I think the book was another one, just because for the very first time, I was traveling to camps and traveling to folks that were displaced, that were currently, I haven't been resettled before. Up until that point, most of my work had been with resettled refugees. And so with the book, it was completely new. It was like completely going to camps, going to spaces where folks were, you know, displaced in that moment and really were in limbo. Like they didn't know where they were going to be. In some cases from, you know, a day to the next, and others, you know, months or years. So I think that was one thing that was really just powerful, to be able to see that other perspective, and also made me think a lot about how much more we need to do to connect populations that are currently resettled and then populations that haven't been resettled. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there to connect those populations, whether it's through storytelling or other means. Obviously, there are different priorities for both of those populations, because there's, you know, there's an assumed stability on one end versus a next where you're just trying to figure things out. But I think the book was big, and a big way of trying to figure out, okay, well, what's my own relationship to all of these different stories, of course? How do I become more responsible for these stories, of the telling of these stories, and make sure that I know when to step back and when to not step back? It's something I'm always, you know, thinking about and considering. And that's something that's always continued, you know. And the book too, you know, my work is thrown about throughout, but it took so to try and figure out, okay, well, what is my place here? Like, do I want to be in this? Do I not want to be in this? I don't want to distract from the other works there. But I hope that in the end that my presence there is hopefully a mediating force for the other works throughout.
Okay, we have a question from May. May, do you want to, oh, you said you won't be able to, so I will read May's question. Absolutely enjoyed reading your book, Ahmed. My question is somewhat of an annoying request. If you can read part of one of your poems, in parentheses, thank you letter from the bomb that visited my home. Also curious question, when did you write this letter?
Yeah, I don't have the book with me now, but I will tell you about background of that poem and how it initially started.
Yeah.
So this was, I think, my freshman year of college. I was part of slam poetry team, and we had these different exercises around obviously the writing of poems, but this idea of using different, whether it's an object or it's the memory, whether it's a place, and humanizing that place and then having it talk to you in different ways. I forget the exact poetic term for it. And I thought a lot about this. I thought, okay, well, what object or what event, why, what could it be here? What could I talk about? And then that event that changed my life and my family's life, of the bomb that came into our home in 2006, that forced us to leave to Syria and then eventually be resettled to the US. It's an event that I've talked about quite a bit, but I've never really, I've shied away from diving into it in any depth, because it's, again, obviously it's something that's very intense and traumatic in different ways. And so I thought, this exercise was a way of doing that, both, with the depth, but also with separation, where you're assuming the perspective of this thing that, changed your life, but you have the power over it this time. It doesn't have power over what you want to express and what your trajectory is, right? And so it was a reclamation of power and of reclaiming that tragedy and saying, well, this is what I think it would say to me now, and it was also just in terms of thinking about it and editing it, over so many different sessions, figuring out, okay, well, what do I want it to say to me? And is that the motivation? Or what am I trying to figure out here? And so ultimately it was just a way of just trying to understand what it was trying to say, or at least what I wanted it to say. And then looking back at that moment in life, it happened in 2006. And then at that point, it was, I think, 2016, 2017 that it was being written and edited, and thinking about, those 10 years and what has happened in those 10 years, and then the lessons from those 10 years, and then how they could be kind of applied for the next 10 years and 10 years after that. And so it was a way of moving past that event, I think, but also thinking about its impact in a way that put me in the driver's seat rather than the actual event. Oh, Mikey, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks, May, for the question. I think we have enough time for one more question from Sam. Sam, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
I'm a big fan, Ahmed, and your book is amazing.
Thank you so much.
I just had a question, which I seem to have lost, but basically, while taking all these stories and getting these stories from the different people and the different youth around the world, did you find that there was something common that was surprising to you about these stories? I'm pretty sure there's a lot of common aspects of being refugees, but was there something that took you by surprise?
I think that this maybe cheating by answering this way, but I think the thing that surprised me most, that there wasn't necessarily one theme. All of these different experiences, whether it's a drawing by a 6-7-year-old girl to, a painting by a 27-year-old or a poem by a 27-year-old, there are kind of these themes of the assumed themes of displacement, right? Everyone in the book has experienced displacement in some way, shape, or form, but it didn't necessarily translate to what they wanted to express. To Mikey's point earlier, it's definitely part of the story, and it was part of the story for many of the folks featured in the book, at least directly in what they chose to feature. But for a lot of the folks, they talked about something completely different. And that was really the goal of this entire project, is to create that space for something beyond what we assume is a theme or a thing that has come up. So I think the thing that wasn't necessarily as surprising, but I was happy that it actually ended up coming to fruition, was this idea that, you know, there is no one displacement story, and that within, and there is no such thing as a displacement story. We have stories that have been touched by displacement, and then they're shared in different ways. And so I think if anything, the shared experience of displacement was really powerful in the creation of the work, right? Like when I met someone, I was able to share my own personal experience, knowing full well that mine was, you know, had been completely different from theirs. You know, my family was very lucky to not have spent any time in the camp. But yeah, so I think what brought us together at that point was this shared displacement in some way, shape, or form. But then the way that was articulated in the project was in a completely different way, and in a multitude of ways. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Great. I'd love to thank Sarah for joining and co-hosting and also helping make this event possible. So thanks, Sarah. And very special thanks to Ahmed. Thanks so much for sharing your perspective. It was really, really great to talk to you. And to everyone who's joined. If you'd like to find Ahmed's information online, he's a very Googleable person. You can check out the book where books are found. Please follow his work. You're up to so many cool things. Ahmed, thanks so much for being part of this. I posted 2 links into the chat. One to give us feedback. It's afikra.com/wasthisgood. It's a single question. Please answer it, give us feedback. And if you'd like to become one of our monthly supporters who help make all of this work happen, please consider that too. I put that in the chat, and join us for upcoming events.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Ahmed. Thank you, Mikey.
Thanks, y'all. Bye, everybody.